The Tsuyama Massacre is a shocking tale of sexual rejection, revenge, and mass murder. 90 minutes was all it took for 21-year-old Mutsu to single-handedly wipe out half the population of his village using only an old modified Browning shotgun, a Japanese katana sword, and a wood-cutting axe. It remains the worst mass murder carried out by a lone perpetrator in Japanese history. And although our story takes place over a century ago, in the years leading up to World War II, its motivations and the way in which it was carried out are strikingly reminiscent to some of the news headlines of today. Behind me is Tsuyama City, more or less the site of the massacre as it stands today. As you can see, even in 2021, it is a very rustic and isolated setting. I visit this city at least several times a year on business, hence the clothing today, and I've been meaning to make this video for a while. I was even posted here for about 4 months, so I lived in this city. I even broke 2 of my arms at the same time in this city, but that's a story for another video. Every time I'm here, I can't help but ponder what happened all those years ago. Because it's not really the type of place that you would think would have such a dubious distinction. Also, although normally the subject matter of this video would fall outside the scope of what I normally cover on this channel, as you'll see as our tale progresses, this story is steeped in the history, culture, and mindset of the more remote and far-flung regions of Japan, so I think it qualifies. But before I start, I need to give my standard disclaimer before I talk about any sort of grisly story. This is a story of extreme violence and brutality, so if you're not interested in hearing about that sort of thing, now is the time to turn off this video. Tsuyama is located in the mountains of Okayama Prefecture in central Japan. Now, I'm sure the locals would take some issue with me saying this, but it doesn't have a particularly noteworthy history, if I'm just being honest. It's pretty much known for its castle these days, which apparently, way back before it was just the foundation that it is today, it was pretty grand. There are also several popular hot spring towns and hot springs in neighboring cities, namely Yubara Onsen and Yunogo Onsen, both of which I've been to before, so I can attest to that fact. They're very lovely. But otherwise, it's just another rural community in the vast expanses of the Japanese countryside. Just north of Tsuyama proper is the small village today known as Kamocho Kurami, and this is where our story takes place. Mutsu was the son of relatively well-off parents, both of whom died of tuberculosis when he was young. He and his sister were then sent off to live with his grandmother in the aforementioned town. Now, by several accounts of the time, he was a relatively outgoing child who didn't seem overly affected by his lack of parents and his sort of unorthodox and unusual upbringing. However, he and his sister were very close, and when she got married and moved away in 1934, Mutsu became very withdrawn and troubled. He was only 17 at the time. Over the next few years, Mutsu became fascinated with the famous story of Sada Abe, who was a former prostitute who murdered her lover and apparently kept his severed genitalia in her kimono for several days afterwards. I won't get into the details of that story because they are even worse than that. But I highly recommend you read about it. It's a really fascinating story, really interesting, salacious stuff. I'll put a link to it in the description below. It was also during this time that Mutsu started participating in the ancient custom known as Yubai. Now, I can speak from experience when I say that in Japan, but just around the world in general, people from the countryside tend to have a different set of values, sensibilities, culture, customs, all that stuff than those in more urban settings. I married into a more, let's say, rural family here in Japan, so I can tell you from experience that a lot of the older customs are much more well preserved in the countryside, or inaka as they say in Japanese. One such ancient custom was known as Yubai. The Chinese characters are literally night and crawl, so essentially you could translate it as night crawling. From what I understand, this was when young unmarried men would go out at night basically looking for sex, and they would enter the houses of young unmarried women, but not always the case, it depended on the area and the city, and they would make their intentions known in the dark, naked, and if the woman consented, they would proceed to do the deed, and the man would sneak out of the house, and the parents would deny ever having seen anything the next day, even if they knew what had happened. Some sources say that this custom was once widespread across Japan, with different regions having variations on the same custom. In some places, apparently, only locals were allowed to participate, whereas in others, travelers could as well. Sometimes it was only married people who could do this. I don't know how to explain that, but the point is there were different varieties. Now, what was the reason behind this bizarre custom? Well, some say it was to find a future marriage partner, which some did through this practice. It might have just been to satisfy sexual urges. It might have been a sexual repression thing where people were just doing it in secret at night in an accepted way, rather than out in the open where they might get, in trouble socially for doing such things. In any case, it seemed to be this weird unspoken thing that was big back in the day. And during Mutsuo's time, even as late as the 1930s, it was still alive and well in this region. And Mutsuo actually, our perpetrator today, he was known as being particularly fond of going out at night and doing this, and he was thus described as being hypersexual. Now, within this whole context of his increasingly troubling behavior and fascinations and activities, to add insult to injury, in 1937, Mutsuo was diagnosed with tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed both his parents. Now you have to remember that back then, there was no cure for this, and tuberculosis was basically a death sentence. It was just slow degeneration, and once you were diagnosed with it, you knew your time was dwindling. Mutsuo was 20 years old at the time when he heard his diagnosis, and as soon as the young women and the people of the village got wind of his diagnosis, apparently they started rebuffing his sexual advances, perhaps understandably, and he started to be treated by everyone in the village, not just the young ladies, as a bit of an outcast. He was then stigmatized, ostracized, all that stuff, which I'm sure only furthered his troubled thoughts. So, unable to satisfy his sexual urges, with nothing left to live for and anger in his heart, he decided it was time to get revenge. Soon after this, Mutsuo came to the conclusion that he should simply kill everyone that had wronged him in his village, which was apparently, according to him, a very sizable number of people in his village. And strangely, or perhaps not so strangely given his mental state, he began to speak of his plans somewhat openly around. Someone inevitably, I think, reported this to the police, who then came to his house and promptly confiscated his firearms and took away any license that he had to possess them. However, they were not able to arrest him or go any further at the time for lack of evidence that, he actually had done anything wrong. So this was just a minor hiccup for Mutsuo, and he very quickly started gathering firearms in secret through secret channels of one sort or another. They don't really go into detail in the sources. And he started developing new plans to exact revenge. This is disturbingly similar to some more modern mass shootings where the authorities were either unwilling or unable to act upon a tip about someone who was deranged and who people thought was a threat to the community. So I think it's worth drawing that parallel there and making that consideration. Another thing that I find really interesting about this now living in Japan is just how readily available firearms were. I know this is the countryside and this was an older time, but these days it is very, very challenging to get a hold of firearms and to actually keep them, because you have to keep renewing and taking tests every year. So that's another really interesting contrast. Anyway, he carefully considered when the best time would be to act, and he chose a night when he knew that the maximum number of victims would be back in their homes. He chose the night of May 20th, 1938. So when that night came, the first thing he did was cut the power to the village, plunging everything into darkness. Yes, apparently this was a lot easier back then than it would be today. He then proceeded to go back home and promptly behead his grandmother. I guess to thank her for raising him in the absence of his parents or something. He claimed in his suicide note, from which we know a lot about this case, that he did this so his grandmother wouldn't have to live with the shame and stigma of being a murderer's grandmother. So apparently he was just a nice guy. No, but in all seriousness, I don't mean to make light of this. It's just, it's so perverse that it's hard not to. But that was his first horrible deed of the evening. He then strapped two flashlights of some sort onto his head. Apparently that was how he got suited up for a night of Yubai, or night crawling. And he decided to go hit the town, basically using the ancient custom as a cover for his true intentions. Over the next 90 minutes, he systematically entered one by one the houses of each person he deemed guilty, killing them all in turn. Now, he did this in various ways. Apparently, most of the victims were killed using an old Browning shotgun that he'd procured, but he also used a samurai sword, or katana, for some of them, and also a wood-cutting axe, the same one he actually used to kill his grandmother with. All told, he killed 29, not including his grandmother, before returning home, writing several suicide notes, and then turning the shotgun on himself at dawn. In his suicide notes, he lamented that he was unable to kill several others who he deemed were guilty, because doing so would have involved him killing other family members who were innocent. So apparently he was not going to be indiscriminate in his killing. So there you have it, the infamous Tsuyama Massacre. Until 1982, it was the single worst recorded mass killing by an individual in history, in the world. Okay, so that says something about it. Including himself, 31 people lost their lives in the massacre. And I won't get into politics, but I will say that I think it's worth reflecting on the parallels we see with this particular incident and some of the acts of violence that have happened more recently. There's a troubled young man with feelings of, rejection and alienation, with lots of social issues, which is usually a common theme there. You see a law enforcement that were unwilling or unable to act adequately to stop this. You see firearms, of course, although I won't get into that any further. There's the modern rise of so-called incels and their sense of sexual entitlement that you see here too. This idea that they deserve sex and that women are depriving them of this. you know, all that stuff, and the violence associated with it. You see a lot of incel killings. There was one in my, basically in my hometown in Isla Vista, the Isla Vista killings. So you see a lot of that as well. Now, I won't claim to know how to end this seemingly endless cycle, but I do think it's worth reflecting on these parallels and, you know, asking ourselves some important questions, such as, you know, what should and could be done ahead of time to stop these things, you know? If the police get a tip-off, is there more that we can do without infringing on someone's personal freedoms? Or do we have to just accept that there's a risk there? Because, you know, you can't just arrest someone indefinitely if they haven't actually committed a crime. Finally, you know, what is it about our societies and cultures that creates people like this in the first place, you know? Is there anything that can be done about the conditions of modern society that result in people falling between the cracks, you know, and committing heinous acts like this? I don't know, but I think it's an important question to ask. I don't have the answers to this, but let me know what your thoughts are on this whole thing. If you think there are any answers, please leave them in the comments. And let's keep this discussion going, because I just wanted to tell the tale of a place that I've, you know, been on so many occasions, such a beautiful rural setting where such a heinous act took place. But you know, I think it's up to smarter people than me to decide how to stop these things from happening, or to come up with a solution. By the way, it is summer. I apologize for being a sweaty mess. As always, if you like content like this and you'd like more of it, and you'd like to give me the opportunity to get better at creating content like this, please consider liking and subscribing. And yeah, I'll continue to work on them and provide them. And yeah, again, if you have any suggestions, I also am always looking for them. So everyone, until next time.